It had been 7 years since humanity's introduction to the galactic stage, and Ethan still felt out of place at every interstellar summit. The conference room aboard the RYX diplomatic cruiser was massive, the kind of vast, pristine space that reminded him just how small Earth was in the grand scheme of things. Across the polished table sat representatives from 3 alien species, all with different negotiation styles, and all of them with centuries more experience in dealing with one another than he had. Still, he had come prepared. Or so he thought. "Human," said the RYX delegate, a tall, translucent figure who hadn't given a name. "Your proposal is inadequate." "I understand your concern," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "But if we..." "You do not understand," the RYX said sharply. "You lack the cultural framework to comprehend why your terms are unacceptable." The meeting devolved from there. Each of Ethan's points was methodically dismantled by the RYX delegate's unyielding logic. Every time he tried to explain his position, the alien countered with an argument so precise and articulate that it left him scrambling for a rebuttal. The other representatives watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. After an hour, the RYX leaned back, their body shimmering faintly. "We see no reason to continue this discussion. Your request is denied." Ethan left the chamber feeling defeated, but he wasn't ready to give up. He spent the next few hours reviewing his notes, revising his strategy, and practicing his arguments. When the time came for the next session, he walked into the room determined to do better. But this time, he was met not by the nameless RYX delegate, but by a new figure. "Human envoy," she said, standing at the head of the table. "I am Elra, representative of the RYX collective. I will be handling your negotiations from now on." Ethan blinked. This RYX was shorter than the previous delegate, her translucent form glowing faintly with shades of blue and green. Her tone was calm but carried an unmistakable authority. As she took her seat, Ethan noticed that her movements were deliberate, almost graceful. There was something about her presence that made the room feel quieter, more focused. "Welcome," Ethan said, extending a hand. "I'm Ethan Cross, representing Earth's diplomatic corps." Elra looked at his hand, then at him, and nodded slightly. "We shall begin," she said, her voice even. "State your proposal." Ethan started cautiously, presenting his revised terms and highlighting the mutual benefits. He avoided the points that had been torn apart in the previous session, instead focusing on areas of shared interest. Elra listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed on him. When he finished, she spoke. "You have addressed some of the previous concerns," she said. "However, there are still fundamental flaws in your reasoning." She began to outline each issue with meticulous clarity. Her analysis was detailed, logical, and completely devoid of any personal judgment. She didn't dismiss his points outright, she dissected them, showing where they failed to align with RYX cultural values or interstellar law. For every solution Ethan proposed, she offered a counterpoint that forced him to rethink his approach. As the session continued, Ethan found himself struggling to keep up. Elra's arguments were flawless, her reasoning impeccable. But there was something different about the way she presented her case. Unlike the previous delegate, who had seemed almost eager to shut him down, Elra appeared genuinely interested in reaching an understanding. She didn't raise her voice or dismiss him outright. Instead, she pressed him to clarify, to explain further, to refine his points. When the meeting ended, Ethan was exhausted but intrigued. He had never met anyone, human or alien, who could challenge him so thoroughly while remaining so composed. He returned to his quarters that evening and reviewed every word of their discussion. It wasn't just about winning the argument anymore. It was about understanding her perspective, her reasoning. He realized that to make any progress, he would have to approach this differently. The next day, Ethan walked into the chamber with a new strategy. Instead of presenting a rigid proposal, he started with questions. "Elra," he said, "can you explain more about how the RYX view resource allocation in these regions?" Elra's luminous form shifted slightly as she regarded him. "Resource allocation is determined by multiple factors," she said. "Cultural significance, historical claims, and the projected impact on the local ecosystem all play a role." Ethan nodded. "That makes sense. Could you elaborate on the cultural significance aspect? As Elra explained, Ethan took careful notes, not just on what she said but on how she said it. He noticed subtle inflections in her tone when certain topics came up, slight pauses that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. He asked follow-up questions, not to trap her but to gain a deeper understanding. Over time, their discussions became less adversarial and more collaborative. The other delegates began to take notice. The tense atmosphere that had dominated the earlier meetings began to ease. The human envoy and the RYX construct were no longer locked in a battle of wits. Instead, they were exploring the complexities of the issue together, each offering insights the other had not considered. After one particularly lengthy session, Ethan found himself walking with Elra down one of the cruiser's long, curving corridors. The light panels along the walls cast a soft glow, reflecting off her translucent form. "I have to admit," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "you're probably the most challenging negotiator I've ever worked with." Elra glanced at him, her eyes, if they could be called eyes, faintly glowing. "You are, not what I expected," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Good or bad?" Elra tilted her head, a gesture he had learned to recognize as thoughtful. "Different," she said. "You approach discussions not as conflicts, but as shared endeavors. It is not a method we encounter often." Ethan smiled. "Guess we humans have a thing for collaboration." Elra considered his words. "If that is true, then why do you persist in promoting terms that fail to account for the values of others?" "Fair point," Ethan admitted. "I'll keep working on that. But I'll need your help." Elra stopped and turned to face him. "You seek my assistance?" "Well, yeah," he said. "You clearly know what you're talking about, and I'd rather learn from you than keep stumbling around in the dark." Elra was silent for a moment, her glowing form shifting slightly. Finally, she said, "Very well. If you are willing to listen, I will guide you." From that day on, their negotiations took on a new rhythm. Ethan wasn't just arguing his case anymore, he was learning, adapting, and collaborating. Elra, for her part, seemed to take a certain satisfaction in helping him refine his approach. Their debates were still challenging, but they were no longer battles. They were something else entirely. The diplomatic cruiser's conference room was unusually quiet. Ethan stepped inside, his boots making the faintest of echoes against the polished floor. The RYX delegates were already seated, their translucent forms shimmering faintly under the room's ambient lighting. At the head of the table, Elra sat with her hands resting lightly on the table's surface, her gaze fixed on him as if she were already preparing a counterargument before he even opened his mouth. Ethan adjusted his jacket and offered a polite nod. "Thank you for making the time," he began. "I'd been reviewing our last discussion and—" "The inconsistencies in your proposal have not been resolved," Elra interrupted, her tone calm but firm. "We appreciate your efforts to refine the terms, but they remain incompatible with RYX policy." "I hear you," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. "I just think there's room for compromise here. Maybe if we focus on the mutual benefits." "You are proceeding from a fundamentally flawed premise," Elra said. "Mutual benefits cannot be realized until the underlying principles align." Ethan sighed inwardly. The RYX were a species that thrived on precision. Their logic was impeccable, their arguments ironclad. They didn't negotiate in the human sense of the word, they presented carefully calculated positions and expected others to fall in line. He glanced down at his tablet, scrolling through his notes. "Could you clarify which principles, specifically, are causing the issue?" Elra's luminous form shifted slightly. "The principle of non-interference, for one. The proposed partnership would necessitate actions that encroach upon RYX-controlled systems." "But we're not suggesting any permanent installations," Ethan countered. "We're proposing a temporary collaboration, a shared effort to secure the region's stability." The RYX representative next to Elra, a shorter figure with an emerald hue, leaned forward. "Stability is subjective. What you consider stable, we may see as an imbalance." Ethan resisted the urge to run a hand through his hair. Instead, he leaned on the table, meeting Elra's gaze directly. Look, I understand where you're coming from, but we're not here to upend the status quo. We're here because we believe that working together on a limited scale can benefit everyone. Elra tilted her head slightly. Your belief does not equate to practicality. I'm not just talking about belief, Ethan said, his voice firming. I'm talking about measurable outcomes. If we coordinate efforts, we can reduce resource strain, improve communication between our factions, and prevent misunderstandings that could escalate into larger conflicts. The emerald-hued RYX exchanged a glance with Elra. For the first time, Elra seemed to consider his words, rather than immediately refuting them. Ethan took the opening. Think of it as a trial run, he pressed. A short-term, carefully monitored arrangement. If it doesn't work out, we reassess. But if it does, it sets a precedent for future collaboration. Elra leaned back in her chair, her translucent features softening slightly. You propose a limited engagement? Yes, Ethan said. Strictly defined parameters. Regular evaluations. No long-term commitments unless both sides agree. The room fell silent as the RYX delegation appeared to confer among themselves in their own language, a series of soft hums and flickering lights that Ethan couldn't interpret. He glanced around the room, noticing that even the other alien representatives, who had been largely silent up to this point, seemed to be watching the exchange with interest. After what felt like an eternity, Elra turned back to him. Your suggestion warrants further analysis. We will review your revised proposal and convene tomorrow to discuss the parameters. Ethan nodded. Fair enough. I'll make sure the revised document is sent to you by the end of the day. As the meeting adjourned, the other delegates filed out, leaving Ethan and Elra momentarily alone. Ethan hesitated, then decided to take a chance. May I ask you something, Elra? He said. She paused, turning back to face him. What is it? Why did the RYX decide to replace the previous delegate with you? Elra's gaze didn't waver. The collective determined that a more nuanced approach was required. My predecessor's methodology was insufficiently adaptive. And you're considered more adaptive? Elra tilted her head, the faint glow of her form shifting. I am designed to engage in more complex forms of discourse. It was deemed necessary for this negotiation. Ethan considered her words. So, you're designed to win arguments? I am designed to resolve disputes, Elra corrected. Ethan smiled faintly. Well, I have to admit, you're pretty good at it. Elra regarded him for a moment before nodding slightly. And you are persistent. It is not an approach I often encounter. Ethan chuckled. It's a human thing, I guess. We tend to keep at it until we find a way. That remains to be seen, she replied. But her tone wasn't dismissive. If anything, it seemed contemplative. They left the conference room together, walking side by side down the cruiser's curved corridor. The walls shimmered faintly, a reminder of the alien technology surrounding them. You know, Ethan said, glancing over at her, I think this might actually work. If we can find common ground, if we can show that cooperation is possible, it might change the way humans and RYX see each other. Change is rarely achieved so easily, Elra said. True, Ethan agreed. But we've got to start somewhere. Elra nodded slightly. Perhaps. As they continued down the corridor, Ethan couldn't help but feel a flicker of something unexpected. He had come here expecting a battle of wills, a test of his diplomatic skills against an impenetrable opponent. What he found instead was someone who, while formidable, was also willing to listen, if only just enough to keep him on his toes. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt that the impossible task before him might not be so impossible after all. Ethan sat at his desk in the dimly lit conference room, surrounded by datapads and glowing displays. He had been poring over records, cultural notes, and diplomatic guidelines for hours, hoping to find an angle that might finally break the deadlock. With a sigh, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. You're staring at those files like they owe you money, a voice said from behind him. Ethan turned to see Callum, one of the human mission's logistics officers, leaning against the doorway. Hey, Cal. What brings you here? Figured you could use a break. You've been holed up in here since morning, Callum said, stepping into the room. We're getting concerned you'll turn into a datapad if you keep it up. Ethan chuckled. I'll take that under advisement. Callum pulled up a chair and sat across from him. Seriously, how's it going with our RYX friends? Making any progress? Depends on what you call progress, Ethan said. Elra is an enigma. She's the most skilled negotiator I've ever dealt with. She doesn't just shoot down my arguments, she takes them apart piece by piece and shows me exactly why they won't work. Sounds exhausting, Callum said. It is, Ethan admitted. But it's also fascinating. She's not just dismissing me. She's listening, really listening. And she's forcing me to think differently about how I approach this whole negotiation. Callum leaned back, crossing his arms. You know, some people might say you're starting to like her. Like her? Ethan raised an eyebrow. I respect her skill, sure. But like is a strong word. Callum said, clearly unconvinced. So, what's your next move? I'm trying to find common ground, something that benefits both sides. The challenge is that the RYX value logic and consistency above all else. I can't just pitch a deal that sounds good, I have to prove that it aligns with their entire worldview. Callum nodded slowly. And what happens if you can't? Ethan tapped his fingers on the desk. Then we're stuck. And that's not an option. Earth needs this partnership, and the RYX could benefit from it too, even if they don't see it yet. Sounds like you've got a lot riding on this. Yeah, Ethan said quietly. I do. Callum stood, giving him a pat on the shoulder. Well, if anyone can figure it out, it's you. Just don't forget to eat something. You're no good to anyone if you keel over from hunger. Ethan smiled faintly. Thanks, Cal. I'll keep that in mind. As Callum left, Ethan turned back to his notes. He started to highlight potential points of agreement, areas where RYX and human interests overlapped. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that understanding Elra's perspective was the key. If he could find a way to appeal to her logic while demonstrating the value of collaboration, he might just have a chance. Later that evening, Ethan found himself in a small lounge on the ship. The room was quiet, with only the faint hum of the engines in the background. Elra stood by one of the large observation windows, her luminous form casting a soft glow against the darkened interior. She turned as he approached, her translucent eyes meeting his. Envoy Cross, she said. What brings you here at this hour? I could ask you the same, Ethan said, gesturing to the view outside. It's a beautiful sight. Elra tilted her head slightly. Humans often describe such vistas as beautiful. Why is that? Ethan leaned against the frame of the window, gazing out at the endless stars. Because it reminds us how small we are, how much there is to explore. It's humbling, but it's also inspiring. Inspiring, Elra repeated, as though tasting the word. It is an interesting concept. For the RYX, the vastness of space is a dataset, an array of variables to be understood and accounted for. And do you enjoy understanding it? Ethan asked. Elra was silent for a moment. Enjoyment is not a concept we prioritize. Our focus is on achieving clarity and consistency. Well, clarity and consistency sound pretty satisfying to me, Ethan said. But maybe there's room for a little enjoyment too. She regarded him for a long moment. You approach things differently than most envoys I have encountered. Ethan smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. It is merely an observation, she said, though her tone softened just slightly. They stood in silence for a while, the stars outside filling the quiet between them. Ethan eventually turned to her. Elra, can I ask you something? You may, she replied. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to step outside your role? To do something that isn't part of the mission? Elra considered his question. Such thoughts are not productive. My purpose is to fulfill my designated functions. But what if you could? Ethan pressed. What if you had the chance to do something for yourself, just because you wanted to? She looked away, her luminous features flickering slightly. It is not a question I have considered. Ethan nodded slowly. Well, maybe you should. They parted ways soon after, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Elra was still the impeccable negotiator, still the master of logic and reason. But beneath that flawless exterior, he thought he caught a glimpse of something more. Something that made him think that, perhaps, there was more to her than she let on. The RYX vessel's observation deck wasn't just quiet, it was serene. The expansive window revealed a panoramic view of the starfield, the pinpricks of light casting a faint glow onto the polished floor. Ethan leaned against the railing, arms crossed, his eyes tracing constellations he would never have known if not for this assignment. Elra stood beside him, her luminous form reflecting faint blue-green hues against the glass. She wasn't looking at the stars, though. She was studying Ethan's expression as he gazed out into the void. Do you miss your home planet? She asked suddenly. He glanced at her, surprised. What brought that question on? Elra tilted her head slightly, a motion Ethan was beginning to recognize as her version of a shrug. Humans often speak of longing for Earth. I have read many accounts that describe a profound connection to your origin world. Ethan turned back to the stars, his lips curling into a faint smile. I guess I do, S. And him. These seem intangible. Difficult to quantify. They are, Ethan agreed. But they matter. Some things can't be measured or catalogued. They just exist, and they mean something, even if you can't fully explain why. Elra was quiet for a moment. Then, almost hesitantly, she said, there are certain phenomena within RYX culture that defy explanation. We have traditions whose origins are unknown, whose purposes are no longer clear. Yet we continue them. Why? Ethan asked, genuinely curious. Because they provide structure, she said, carefully choosing her words. A sense of continuity. Sounds like they mean something, even if you can't put it into numbers, Ethan said with a gentle smile. Elra looked at him, her translucent features reflecting the starlight. Perhaps. They stood in companionable silence for a while. It was a rare moment when Ethan didn't feel like he was negotiating or arguing or trying to prove a point. It was just a conversation. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. So, if you don't mind me asking, what brought you here tonight? I mean, to the observation deck. Elra's gaze drifted back to the stars. I find this view calming. It allows for reflection. And you? Same, I guess. After a long day of going back and forth in the conference room, it's nice to just look out there. Puts things in perspective. Perspective is valuable, Elra said softly. Ethan turned to her again, his curiosity piqued. Do you ever get tired of it all? The constant negotiations, the endless arguments? Elra's glow shifted slightly, her head tilting. It is my purpose. I was designed to engage in these processes. That's not what I asked, Ethan said gently. Do you ever get tired of it? Elra hesitated, as if searching for the correct response. Finally, she said, I do not experience fatigue in the same way humans do. But, there are moments when I question the value of these exchanges. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Questioning things can help you grow, see new possibilities. Growth is not my primary function, she replied. Doesn't mean it's not important, Ethan said. Maybe it's something worth exploring. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was something unspoken between them. A shared understanding, perhaps, or a mutual curiosity. Whatever it was, it felt significant. Would you like to continue this conversation elsewhere? Ethan asked, surprising even himself with the suggestion. Elra seemed to consider it for a moment, then nodded. I would not object. They left the observation deck and walked through the quiet corridors of the ship. Along the way, Ethan asked her more about RYX culture, about their art, their music, their history. Elra answered thoughtfully, sharing pieces of her world that Ethan found both fascinating and, at times, surprisingly familiar. In turn, Ethan spoke of Earth. He described landscapes, foods, festivals, and the way humans came together to celebrate or mourn. He spoke of the first time he saw snow and the smell of a campfire on a cool night. Elra listened, her questions probing deeper into why these experiences held meaning for him. It was in these moments, walking side by side and sharing pieces of themselves, that Ethan began to see Elra not as a negotiator, not as an opponent, but as an individual. She might have been created with a purpose, but she was more than that. She had thoughts, questions, and, Ethan suspected, feelings, though she might not recognize them as such. They ended up in a smaller chamber, a quiet lounge with a few chairs and a low table. Elra sat across from Ethan, her glowing form casting soft light onto the metallic surface. "Your descriptions of Earth are vivid," she said. "I find it intriguing how much emphasis you place on sensory experiences." "That's just how we are," Ethan said with a shrug. "We connect with the world through our senses. Sight, sound, touch, it all shapes how we think and feel." Elra's gaze shifted slightly. "You mentioned touch. Humans often describe it as a source of comfort." "It can be," Ethan said. "Sometimes a simple gesture, like a handshake or a pat on the back, can mean more than words." Elra seemed to consider this. After a pause, she said, "It is not a concept I am familiar with." "Well, it's not something you can fully explain," Ethan said. "It's something you experience." There was a long moment of silence between them, a kind of charged stillness. Then, cautiously, Elra extended a hand toward him, her translucent fingers shimmering faintly. Ethan hesitated only briefly before reaching out and letting his hand rest lightly on hers. The sensation was unlike anything he had felt before. Her touch was cool but not unpleasant, her form almost intangible yet still present. It wasn't the same as holding another human's hand, but it carried a weight of its own, a gesture of trust, of connection. Elra looked at their joined hands, her expression thoughtful. "Interesting," she said softly. Ethan smiled. "It's a start." They stayed like that for a while, their conversation continuing in soft tones. For the first time, Ethan felt like they weren't just negotiating or debating. They were simply being. And in that moment, he realized that the bond they were forming was more than a diplomatic strategy. It was something real, something personal. Something neither of them had expected. The meeting room hummed with the quiet buzz of alien technology. Ethan sat at one end of the long table, his datapad in hand. Across from him, Elra was scrolling through a holographic display, her translucent fingers moving with deliberate precision. For once, they weren't surrounded by a crowd of other delegates. It was just the two of them, a final session to review the terms they'd spent weeks refining. "This section," Elra began, pointing to a line of text that hovered in the air, "remains ambiguous. You state that both parties will collaborate on shared objectives, yet you have not defined those objectives with sufficient clarity." Ethan leaned forward. "The idea is to leave room for flexibility. If we lock in every detail now, we might find ourselves boxed into agreements that don't fit the evolving situation." "Flexibility invites misinterpretation," Elra said calmly. "It is better to establish a framework that can be adjusted with mutual consent." He nodded, appreciating her logic. "Okay, how about we specify the main objectives: resource sharing, communication protocols, and security measures, but include a clause that allows for amendments after periodic reviews?" Elra considered his suggestion, her glowing features reflecting faint shades of green. "That approach is acceptable. I will note it as a provisional agreement." They worked through the remaining points methodically, each offering adjustments and counterarguments, refining the language until both felt the document was as close to perfect as it could be. The process had become less about winning or losing and more about achieving a solution they both believed in. When they reached the final clause, Elra leaned back, her gaze fixed on Ethan. "You have improved significantly since our initial discussions." He grinned. "Are you saying I'm finally starting to make sense?" Elra's expression remained composed, though there was a faint shimmer in her gaze that Ethan had come to interpret as amusement. "You have learned to approach these matters with greater precision and forethought." I'll take that as a compliment, he said with a chuckle. And I'll admit, you've pushed me to think more critically. I've learned a lot from you. Elra nodded slightly, her translucent form flickering softly. Learning is a reciprocal process. I have also gained new perspectives from our discussions. Glad to hear it, Ethan said. I wasn't sure I'd ever get through to you at first. You did not get through, Elra corrected gently. You presented information and arguments that warranted consideration. That is all. Sure, Ethan said, smirking. Whatever you say. They shared a rare moment of light-hearted silence. Ethan glanced down at the finalized document, then looked back at Elra. So, does this mean we're done? For now, she replied. The terms will need to be reviewed and approved by the respective governing bodies, but our work here is complete. Ethan set down his datapad, exhaling in relief. Well, it's been a long road, but I think we've done something good here. Elra regarded him quietly. Do you believe these agreements will truly bring about the changes you seek? He considered the question carefully. I think it's a step in the right direction. The real work starts once we implement the terms. But if we've laid the right foundation, we'll have a chance to build something better. Elra nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. It is a rational conclusion. High praise from you, Ethan said, grinning. So, what's next for you? I will continue my assignments as designated by the collective, Elra replied. And that's it? No plans to, I don't know, take a vacation or do something different for a change? Ethan asked. Vacations are not a concept within our YX protocol, Elra said. We are assigned tasks according to our capabilities. When one is completed, another is allocated. Ethan tilted his head. But what if you could choose? If you didn't have a directive, what would you do? Elra hesitated. I have not considered such a scenario. My existence is defined by my purpose. Sure, Ethan said, but maybe it doesn't have to be. I mean, look at what we've done here. This wasn't just following a script. We adapted, worked together, found common ground. That wasn't in the manual. You imply that I have deviated from my purpose, Elra said, her tone even. Not at all, Ethan said quickly. I'm saying you've expanded it. You've shown you can do more than just follow instructions. You can think for yourself, make decisions based on new information. Elra studied him, her glow shifting subtly. You suggest that I am more than what I was created to be? Ethan shrugged. I think we all have that potential, if we're willing to see it. Elra was silent for a long moment. Finally, she said, you are an unusual individual, Envoy Cross. Ethan, he corrected. And I'll take that as a compliment. She inclined her head slightly. Very well, Ethan. They rose from the table, the finalized agreements stored in their respective systems. As they walked toward the exit, Ethan glanced at Elra. You know, I don't think this is the last time we'll be working together. It is possible, she said. Our respective roles may bring us into contact again. Well, if that happens, I'll look forward to it, Ethan said with a smile. Elra regarded him, her expression unreadable. I will take that into consideration. They parted ways at the main corridor, Ethan heading toward his quarters and Elra toward her assigned workspace. As he walked, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. When he'd first met her, she had seemed like an immovable obstacle, a force of pure logic that couldn't be reasoned with. Now, she felt more like a partner, someone he respected and maybe even trusted. And while their work was officially done, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something greater. Something he couldn't quite define but knew was important. And for now, that was enough.